Hello, and welcome. Settle in, close your eyes, and allow the day to recede. Tonight, we will not be marching with legions or debating in the Senate. Instead, we will be taking a quiet walk through the back alleys of the Roman imagination, exploring the strange and subtle superstitions that clung to the city like ivy. We are here to listen to the whispers, the tall tales and the urban legends of the ancient world. Hopefully, it is a journey just immersive enough and just gentle enough to help you drift peacefully away. So let us begin. The air grows heavy first. It's a pressure you feel deep in your bones, a stillness that falls over the 7 hills like a shroud. You're walking through the forum, the dust of a long, hot day clinging to your sandals, when you notice the sky has turned the color of a bad bruise. The usual cacophony of Rome, the shouting merchants, the rumbling of cartwheels on stone, the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer, seems to quiet, to hold its breath. And then the first crack of thunder echoes not from across the hills, but from directly overhead, as if Jupiter himself has cleared his throat. The crowd around you stills. A senator pauses mid-sentence, his hand still raised in an emphatic gesture. A slave carrying a basket of figs looks up, his eyes wide. This is not just weather, not to a Roman. This is a conversation, and you are not meant to be an equal participant. A sudden gust of wind whips through the colonnades, carrying the scent of rain on hot marble, and something else, ozone and a faint electric tang of divine displeasure. This is a world where the gods are not distant, abstract concepts. They are your neighbors, and they have very, very thin skins. In a city built on order, this is the ultimate, terrifying reminder that you are never truly in control. Every decision, every venture, every breath is taken under the watchful and often judgmental eyes of the heavens.
This divine anxiety trickled down from the grand theater of the sky into every facet of daily life, leading to some peculiar professions. Forget stockbrokers or data analysts. A truly indispensable man in certain Roman circles was the Pilarius, the sacred chicken keeper. Imagine the scene. It is the dawn of a battle that will decide the fate of thousands. An entire legion stands arrayed in the gray morning light, their shields polished, their nerves humming with a mixture of fear and adrenaline. The air is cold, smelling of damp wool and leather, and all of this immense, brutal power, the muscle, the steel, the strategy, is held in check, waiting. Waiting for what? For a man carrying a cage of chickens. He walks with a solemnity you might expect from a high priest, his face a mask of concentration. The general, a man who has conquered provinces and bathed in blood, now watches this humble servant with the focus of a hawk. The Pilarius opens the cage, scatters a handful of specially prepared grain, and the world waits. Will they eat? Will they eat with gusto, their pecking a vigorous, enthusiastic sign of divine approval? Or will they turn away, uninterested, and in doing so, sign the death warrant for an entire army? It's a strange and delicate hinge upon which to swing the gates of history, but such was the weight of whispers from the gods. To ignore them was not just foolish, it was an act of profound and often fatal arrogance.
Which brings us to Publius Claudius Pulcher, a man who, it is safe to say, was not burdened by an excess of patience for poultry-based predictions. It is 249 BC, and Pulcher's fleet is preparing to face the Carthaginian navy at the Battle of Drepana. The ships are ready, the oarsmen are at their benches, the marines are itching for a fight. The moment is ripe. But there is, of course, the matter of the ritual. The Pularius is summoned, the cage is presented, the grain is scattered. The chickens, perhaps sensing the salty air or simply having a bout of avian indigestion, refuse to eat. A hush falls over the flagship. The crew exchanges nervous glances. This is not just a bad sign, it is the worst sign. The gods are effectively turning their backs on the entire operation. But Pulcher, a man of action and very little introspection, is not having it. He stares at the obstinate birds, then at the anxious faces of his men, and a sneer curls his lip. In a moment of supreme world-class hubris, he grabs the cage. "If they will not eat," he bellows for all to hear, "then let them drink." And with that, he heaves the cage, the keeper's career, and several centuries of sacred tradition overboard into the waves. The splash is followed by a stunned silence. You can almost feel the gods raising a collective eyebrow. The battle that followed was, to put it mildly, a catastrophe. Almost his entire fleet was sunk or captured. Pulcher survived, but his name became a byword for sacrilegious arrogance, a cautionary tale told for generations. It was a perfect, bloody lesson. The gods might not always answer, but they are always, always listening.
If Pulcher's mistake was a hot-headed impulse, our next story is one of a cold, calculated greed so vast it seemed to challenge the heavens by its very existence. Let us speak of Marcus Licinius Crassus. To say Crassus was rich is like saying the ocean is damp. His wealth was a force of nature. He owned vast tracts of the city, entire legions of slaves, silver mines that bled bullion day and night. His fortune was so immense it became an abstract concept, a weight on the soul of Rome itself. And like many men who have everything, he discovered it was not enough. He craved what he could not simply buy: military glory, the kind of legacy that gets your name carved into temples. And so, in 55 BC, he set his sights on the one great power Rome had yet to humble, Parthia. He gathered his legions, funding the entire expedition from his own bottomless pockets. Imagine the spectacle of his departure from Rome. 7 legions, over 40,000 men, a river of steel and leather pouring out of the city gates, their standards glinting in the sun. The air is filled with cheers, with the scent of pride and ambition. But standing near the gate, one man is not cheering. It is the tribune Appius Capito, and he has not come to wish Crassus well. He has brought with him a brazier, a small pot of burning coals that emits a strange, acrid smoke. He is a dark, unmoving figure against the backdrop of glorious military pageantry. He is there to perform a ritual far older and far more sinister than a simple protest. He is there to speak a curse. As Crassus and his commanders ride towards the gate, a silence begins to spread from that one spot, radiating outwards through the crowd like a chill. The cheering falters. The confident marching seems to lose its rhythm. All eyes turn to the tribune, a man making himself the enemy of Rome's richest citizen. Capito is unmoved. He begins to chant, his voice low at first, then rising with a terrible, resonant power. He is not shouting insults or political slogans. He is invoking names that make the blood run cold, ancient, half-forgotten gods of the underworld, the primal forces of vengeance and decay. He is performing the execratio, a formal ritual of damnation.
The smoke from his brazier curls in the air, seeming to cling to the polished armor and embroidered banners of Crassus's legions. The curse is specific. It condemns not just Crassus, but his entire army. It calls for them to find no rest, to know only thirst and fear, to have their bodies scattered in the desert, their spirits denied passage into the afterlife. It is a piece of breathtakingly dark theater. Crassus tries to ignore him, to ride past with a dismissive wave, but the damage is done. The words have been spoken. They hang in the air, an invisible poison that has now tainted the entire expedition. Every soldier who heard it, from the highest-ranking legate to the lowliest foot soldier, now marches not just towards Parthia, but under a formal, divine death sentence. The gold in Crassus's war chest suddenly seemed a little less bright, a little colder to the touch. The desert, he would soon find, had been waiting.
And the desert was not kind. The curse, it seems, was frighteningly effective. The Parthian campaign was a masterclass in disaster. The Romans, so accustomed to victory on their own terms, found themselves tormented and outmaneuvered in the vast, searing emptiness of Mesopotamia. The sun was a merciless hammer. The enemy was a ghostly presence, firing arrows from horseback and vanishing before a proper defense could be mounted. The whispers must have started almost immediately among the legionaries, huddled in their camps at night. The curse. The words of Ateus Capito back at the gate. The feeling of being forsaken, abandoned by their own gods in a hostile land. The story culminates in the infamous Battle of Carrhae, a slaughter that shattered Roman military prestige for a generation. And as for Crassus, his fate became a legend twisted with the most exquisite, horrible irony. Captured by the Parthians, he was, according to the tale, executed in a manner befitting his defining characteristic. They held him down, and they brought forth a crucible of molten gold. They pried open his mouth, the mouth that had given so many commands, that had boasted of its limitless wealth, and they gave him his final drink. The legend of Crassus drowning in liquid gold became one of Rome's most potent morality tales. Was it true? Does it matter? It was true enough. It was a story that served as a permanent warning, whispered in the Senate and in the taverns. There are some things you cannot buy, and some debts that can never be repaid, except in the most agonizing way imaginable. Not all omens were as theatrical as a public curse. Sometimes the warnings were quieter, more personal. They came not as a bellowing curse at the city gates, but as a series of unsettling coincidences, a creeping dread that gathers like fog. And there is no greater example of this than the final days of Gaius Julius Caesar. Here was a man at the absolute apex of power, the dictator for life, a figure so monumental he was already beginning to blur into myth. He seemed untouchable, as solid and permanent as the marble temples he had built. But the world around him had begun to fray at the edges, to whisper warnings that only those closest to him seemed to hear. It began, as these things often do, in the dead of night, in the quiet of his grand house, a place of political power, but also a domestic space, a home. His wife, Calpurnia, a woman known for her composure and steady nerve, began to have nightmares. We can imagine her waking with a gasp, the cold sweat on her brow a stark contrast to the fine linen sheets.
She dreamt that the great gabled roof of their house, a feature the Senate had granted Caesar as a special honor, had collapsed into rubble. In another, more visceral nightmare, she dreamt she was cradling his body, weeping over his many wounds. These were not fleeting images, but vivid, recurring terrors that left her pale and shaken by the morning light. They were the first threads in a tapestry of doom that was quickly and very publicly being woven around her husband. The domestic dread soon spilled out into the streets, mingling with the daily life of the city. The stories began to circulate, passed from merchant to senator to baker, growing with each telling. The world, it seemed, was becoming unbalanced. Priests who oversaw the sacrifices, the haruspices, began reporting grim findings. A bull, chosen for its perfection and garlanded for sacrifice to the gods, would be struck down, only for the priests to find it had no heart. An organ so vital, so central, simply missing, a terrifying void where there should have been life. This happened more than once, a sign so unambiguously awful that it caused a shudder of fear throughout the temples. Then came the birds. On the day before the Ides of March, witnesses in the Forum claimed to see a small wren, a laurel sprig clutched in its beak, flying towards the courier of Pompeii, where the Senate was meeting. The laurel was Caesar's symbol, a sign of his victory and divine favor. But before the little bird could reach safety, it was struck down by a flock of larger, predatory birds who tore it apart in mid-air, scattering its feathers and the laurel leaves over the stones below. The symbolism was as subtle as a hammer blow. Caesar, the victor, was about to be torn to pieces by his own kind in the very heart of his power. The gods were no longer whispering. They were putting on a show.
And so we come to the day itself, the Ides of March, the 15th of the month, a day that would forever be stained by blood and betrayal. The morning was gray and damp, the air thick with the accumulated dread of the past weeks. Caesar himself was unwell and deeply unsettled by Calpurnia's frantic pleas for him to stay home. She had dreamt of him assassinated, and she begged him not to go to the Senate. Torn between his wife's terror and his own public image, he hesitated. To cancel a meeting of the Senate because of a woman's bad dream? It would be seen as a sign of weakness. It was at this moment of indecision that he had his most famous and perhaps final warning. On his way to the theater of Pompeii, he saw him in the crowd, the soothsayer, Spurinna, the very man who had warned him weeks before to beware the Ides of March. Feeling confident, perhaps even a little smug, that the day had so far passed without incident, Caesar called out to him. "The Ides of March are come," he said, a casual taunt. Spurinna's reply was calm, quiet, and utterly chilling. "Aye, Caesar," he said, his eyes meeting the dictator's, "but not yet gone." There was nothing left to say. The warning had been given, and it had been dismissed. Caesar continued his walk, moving towards the building where his friends were waiting, with daggers hidden in the folds of their togas. The universe had tried and failed to save a man who would not be saved.
With the death of Caesar, we can pause and reflect on this first part of our journey. This Roman obsession with omens, curses, and portents might seem like simple superstition to us now. We see the storm and think of atmospheric pressure. We see a flock of birds and think of migration. But for the Roman, these events were woven into a grand cosmic narrative. The universe was not a cold, indifferent machine. It was a conscious, often cantankerous entity that was deeply, personally invested in human affairs. A curse was not just an angry shout, it was a legal summons delivered to the gods. A nightmare was not just a trick of the subconscious, it was a postcard from the future. Believing in these things gave the world a strange and sometimes terrifying kind of meaning. It meant that your choices mattered. They mattered so much that the gods would send chickens or dreams or heartless cows to guide you, to warn you, to pass judgment. It was a way of coping with a world that was just as chaotic and unpredictable as our own. And as we move now from the whispers of the gods to the whispers of men, we will see that the Romans were just as adept at creating their own myths, especially when it came to the men who ruled them. We now enter the palace after dark to listen to the scandalous, vicious, and often hilarious tall tales told about the emperors.
Let us leave the world of divine portents and walk into the heart of human power. Imagine yourself on the Palatine Hill late at night. The moon is a perfect silver disk, casting the shadows of cypress trees across sprawling marble courtyards. Below you, the city of Rome is a vast, slumbering beast. But up here, in the home of the Caesars, the silence is different. It's a heavy, watchful quiet. You walk down a long, covered portico, your soft-soled shoes making no sound on the intricate mosaics. On one side, massive columns hold up a ceiling painted with the triumphs of gods and heroes. On the other, open arches reveal a garden where the only sound is the gentle splash of a fountain. This is the official story of Rome, written in stone and gold leaf, a story of power, order, and divine right. But there is another history here. It is a history that is whispered in the kitchens, in the barracks of the Praetorian Guard, in the slave quarters. It is carried on the scent of expensive perfume and spilt wine. It is the story of what happens after the official ceremonies are over and the palace doors are sealed for the night. This is the world of imperial nightmares, the secret lives of the men and women who were worshipped as gods, but whose rumored vices were all too human.
And where else to begin this journey into palace gossip than with the emperor whose name became synonymous with madness, Caligula? It is almost impossible now to separate the historical man from the monstrous caricature created by his enemies and embellished over centuries of gleeful rumor-mongering. The stories told about him were so bizarre, so utterly unhinged, that they almost defy belief. And at the center of the most famous tale is not a person, but an animal, a horse named Incitatus. This was not merely a beloved steed. This was a horse who lived a life of greater luxury than almost any human in the empire. We must picture his stable. It wasn't a barn. It was a villa. The walls were said to be polished marble, the manger carved from ivory. He drank from a golden bucket. He slept under the finest purple blankets, the color of royalty. He even had his own retinue of slaves, dedicated solely to attending to his every equine need, from grooming his coat to serving him oats mixed with gold flakes. Visitors to the palace would be formally invited to dine with the horse. It is a level of absurdity that feels like a fever dream, a symbol of a man whose every whim, no matter how insane, was instantly made reality by the terrifying gravity of his power.
But the story of Incitatus goes one step further, from mere decadence into the realm of political satire so sharp it borders on insanity. The legend, the one told with a nervous laugh in the wine shops of Rome, is that Caligula planned to make his horse a consul, not just an honored guest, but a holder of the highest elected office in the Roman state, an office once held by giants like Brutus and Cicero. Now it was to be held by a horse. On the surface, it's the ultimate proof of a mind gone wild, the act of a lunatic emperor dressing his pet in the robes of state. But let's pause for a moment and listen to the story with a more cynical ear. Was it madness? Or was it the sanest, most viciously brilliant political joke of all time? Imagine the Roman Senate of that period, a collection of terrified, sycophantic men, eager to rubber stamp the emperor's every desire, their power a complete sham. By proposing his horse for the job, Caligula was holding up a mirror to them. He was saying, with a straight face, that his horse could do their job just as well as they could, that its silence was no less valuable than their empty flattery. Was it the act of a madman, or the ultimate contemptuous mic drop from a man who saw the whole system as a farce and wanted everyone to know it? The beauty of the tall tale is that we can never truly know.
If the tales about Caligula were of a madness that was loud, public, and bizarrely comical, the legends surrounding the women of the imperial court were often of a different flavor. They were stories of secret corruption, of a depravity hidden behind a carefully constructed mask of noble virtue. And no empress was the subject of more lurid whispers than Valeria Messalina, the third wife of the Emperor Claudius. By day, Messalina was everything a Roman empress was supposed to be. She was young, beautiful, and famously fertile, having provided Claudius with a male heir, Britannicus. In public, she was the picture of dignity, the dutiful wife standing beside a husband who was brilliant, but often seen as bumbling and weak. She was a key figure in the palace intrigues, a shrewd political operator who knew how to eliminate her rivals. She was the model Roman matron, elevated to the highest possible station. But according to the historians, men, it should be noted, who were writing with a very specific, moralizing agenda, this was all a facade, a mask that was shed as soon as the sun went down. The story they tell is of an empress with an insatiable appetite, who led a secret life that would have scandalized the most hardened legionary, a life she supposedly lived in the grimiest corners of the city.
The legend begins as the palace sleeps. Messalina, the empress of the known world, slips out of her imperial chambers. She conceals her famous red hair beneath a simple blonde wig, disguises her noble features with soot, and cloaks her fine silk robes with the rough, common wool of a working-class woman. She then creeps through the darkened streets, not towards a secret lover's villa, but towards the Supera, the most crowded, chaotic, and disreputable district in Rome. We can imagine the sensory assault, the smell of frying sausages, cheap, sour wine, and unwashed bodies, the sound of shouting, drunken laughter, and arguments spilling out of every tavern and tenement. She makes her way to a lupanar, a brothel, one of the many that littered the district. There, the story goes, she would rent a room under a false name, Liska, the wolf woman. And here, the legend reaches its crescendo. She wasn't there for a secret tryst. She was there to work. The historian Pliny the Elder claims she would challenge the brothel's most seasoned prostitute to a competition, who could service more men before dawn. And Messalina, fueled by what was described as a furious and raging lust, always won. It's a shocking, almost unbelievable story,
a tale of the highest and lowest echelons of Roman society crashing together in one small, squalid room.
It is a story that is almost too perfect in its depravity. The noble empress, driven by an animalistic lust that even the most hardened sex workers found shocking. But we must pause and ask ourselves, through the quiet lens of history, how much of this is true? Is it a factual account of a woman with a truly astonishing libido, or is it something else entirely? Is it perhaps one of the most successful and vicious political smear campaigns in history? Consider the context. Messalina was a woman of immense influence in a world run exclusively by men. She was a kingmaker, or rather an emperor-maker, who had navigated the treacherous currents of the court to place her husband Claudius on the throne. She had ambition, she had intelligence, and she made powerful enemies. In ancient Rome, when you wanted to destroy a powerful woman, you did not attack her intellect or her political strategy. You attacked her virtue. You portrayed her as sexually insatiable, a creature of base appetites who could not control her passions. It was a well-worn and brutally effective tactic. So what is the truth of Messalina? Did she sneak out for nocturnal adventures? Or was she simply a powerful woman whose enemies painted her as a monster? The truth, most likely, is lost to us, buried under centuries of hostile accounts. But the legend itself remains, a fascinating artifact that tells us less about Messalina the person and more about Rome's deep-seated fear of female power. From the secret vices of an empress, we turn to the very public, city-altering ego of an emperor. We turn to Nero. And to understand the greatest tall tale told about him, we must first understand his city. The Rome of 64 AD was not yet a city of marble. It was a chaotic, overgrown, and deeply flammable place. The majority of its 1 million inhabitants lived packed into tall, timber-framed apartment blocks called insulae. The streets were narrow, winding alleys, a tangled maze where cooking fires were a constant necessity and a constant hazard. It was a city of vibrant life, but it was a tinderbox waiting for a spark. And in the hot, dry summer of that year, the spark came. The fire started in the shops surrounding the Circus Maximus, and driven by a strong wind, it did not just spread, it exploded. For 6 days and 7 nights, the fire raged, consuming whole districts. Imagine the scene from a distant hill. The night sky is no longer black, but a terrifying pulsing orange. The roar of the fire is a constant, physical presence, punctuated by the crash of collapsing buildings. The air is thick with smoke and ash, carrying the sounds of panic and despair. Rome, the eternal city, the Caput Mundi, was burning to the ground. And in the middle of this horror, the greatest urban legend of the ancient world was born.
The story is so famous it has become a cliché. While his people fled for their lives and his city was reduced to smoking rubble, the Emperor Nero was making art. The legend, immortalized by later historians, paints an unforgettable picture of monstrous narcissism. As the flames devoured Rome, Nero supposedly ascended to a high vantage point. Some say his own palace, others the Tower of Maecenas. He did not come to direct the firefighting efforts or to grieve for his city. He came to find inspiration. Dressed in full theatrical costume, he took out his lyre, and as he watched the inferno, he began to sing. His chosen subject was the sack of Troy, an epic of ancient destruction.
He plucked the strings of his instrument, his voice rising in song, using the very real tragedy unfolding before him as a dramatic backdrop for his own artistic performance. It is the ultimate image of an emperor completely detached from reality and human suffering. Now, is it true? Almost certainly not. The historian Tacitus, who was a child in Rome at the time, reports that Nero wasn't even in the city when the fire broke out. He was at his seaside villa in Antium, and when he heard the news, he raced back to Rome to lead the relief efforts, opening his private gardens and even his own palace to house the tens of thousands of homeless citizens. But this is the frustrating thing about history. The truth is often less compelling than the legend. And the legend of Nero the fiddler stuck because of what he did next.
Why did such a slanderous story persist, even when eyewitness accounts contradicted it? Because the Roman people needed a motive, and Nero, with his characteristic lack of subtlety, promptly gave them one. On the vast, charred ruins of the city, in the very heart of Rome that the fire had conveniently cleared, Nero began construction on his masterpiece. It was to be a palace so vast and opulent, it was less a house and more a private universe. He called it the Domus Aurea, the Golden House, and it was a legend in itself. It wasn't a single building, but a massive countryside estate built in the middle of a city. It featured a sprawling artificial lake, vineyards, pastures with herds of animals, and forests. The palace itself was an architectural wonder. Parts of it were overlaid with gold. It was inlaid with jewels and mother of pearl. The ceilings of the dining rooms were fitted with revolving panels that could shower guests with flowers and perfume. Its centerpiece was a colossal 120-foot-tall bronze statue of Nero himself, depicted as the sun god, Sol. To the homeless and traumatized citizens of Rome, this was an unforgivable insult. He had built his personal paradise on top of their collective tragedy. Whether he had started the fire or not no longer mattered. He had profited from it so spectacularly that in the court of public opinion, his guilt was sealed forever.
And so, we see a pattern emerge from these imperial tales: the mad horse lover, the debauched empress, the monstrous artist. These stories, whether grounded in truth or born of pure malice, served a vital purpose for the people of Rome. They were a weapon. In a world of absolute power, where a single man held the fate of millions in his hands, ordinary people had very little agency. They couldn't vote him out. They couldn't protest in the streets without risking crucifixion. They couldn't hold him accountable. But they could control his story. They could take the god emperor, the living deity, and through whispers and gossip, they could transform him into a fool, a degenerate, or a monster. It was a form of psychological resistance, a way to cut the giants down to size and reclaim a small measure of power over their own rulers. These urban legends ensured that no matter how grand their statues or how triumphant their arches, history would remember them not just for their deeds, but for the dark, strange, and often ridiculous caricatures their people had created for them. And now, leaving behind the whispers of the living, we turn to our final theme. We turn to the echoes left behind by the dead, to the ghosts of the eternal city.
The hour is late, so late that it has looped back around to being early. The moon, which was once high and bright, now hangs low in the west,
casting long, distorted shadows that stretch like grasping fingers across the cobblestones. The air is cool and still. In the grand sweep of the Forum, the temples and basilicas are hulking, silent silhouettes against a sky beginning to soften towards dawn. This is the Rome that few ever experience, not the bustling heart of an empire, but a ghost town, dreaming of its own past, and in a city that has stood for centuries, a city that has witnessed millions of births and just as many deaths, you have to wonder, does anything linger? When so much life and ambition and tragedy is packed into one small space, does it leave a stain, an echo in the air? The living are asleep, but the city itself feels awake. As we walk these empty streets, we are no longer listening for the whispers of rumor and scandal. We are listening for the whispers of the dead themselves, for the echoes that are said to haunt the eternal city.
Not all spirits were believed to be equal. Some, it was said, were more restless than others, and no spirit was said to be more restless, more bitter than that of the Emperor Caligula. After his bloody assassination by his own guards, his body was not given the proper rites. It was hastily cremated and buried in a shallow, unmarked grave in the Lamian Gardens. For a Roman, this was a terrifying fate, a recipe for a vengeful ghost, a larva, condemned to wander the earth. And so the story began. Let's imagine you are a watchman, assigned to patrol the very same Lamian Gardens a few years later. It is a quiet, thankless job. You walk the same paths night after night, past the manicured hedges and the silent statues. But on some nights, the air feels different. There is a cold spot on the path, a pocket of air so frigid it raises the hairs on your arms, though there is no wind. You hear a rustle in the laurels, but when you turn your lantern, there is nothing there. And then you hear a voice, a faint, mournful sound, seeming to come from the very earth beneath your feet. It is the ghost of the murdered emperor, they say, forever wandering the site of his first dishonorable grave. The story became so pervasive that, eventually, his sisters returned, exhumed his remains, and finally gave him a proper burial, hoping to quiet the malevolent spirit and bring peace to the haunted gardens.
While the ghost of an emperor might haunt a specific garden, there was one place in Rome that was believed to be a gateway for all spirits, a direct line to the underworld. It was not a grand temple or a sinister-looking cave. It was a simple stone-capped pit in the Comitium at the very heart of the Forum. It was called the Mundus Cereris, the world of Ceres. For most of the year, it was an unremarkable feature of the landscape. You could walk right past it and think nothing of it, just another stone lid set into the ground. But this spot was one of the most sacred and feared in the entire city. It was believed to have been created by Romulus himself when he founded Rome, a place to offer the first fruits of the harvest to the goddess of the earth. But its significance went deeper, quite literally. The Romans believed this pit was a physical connection to the realm of the dead. It was a sealed door, and everyone knew that some doors are best left unopened. But 3 times a year, on August 24th, October 5th, and November 8th, the seal was broken.
The stone was rolled away. De mundus patet. The world lies open.
On those 3 days, a strange and anxious quiet would fall over the city. All official business ceased. Temples were closed. Marriages were forbidden, and no army was permitted to march. Why? Because when the priests rolled back the great stone lid of the mundus, it was believed the spirits of the dead, the manes, were free to emerge. The barrier between the world of the living and the world of the dead became thin, porous. For 24 hours, the ghosts of ancestors, good and bad, could swarm out of that dark opening and wander the streets of Rome once more. It was a time of immense spiritual danger. You might come face to face with your great-grandfather or a long-dead enemy. People would take precautions, staying indoors, ensuring the bolts on their doors were slid firmly shut. You can imagine the feeling in the air, a collective holding of the breath. Every shadow seems a little deeper. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind rattling the shutters could be an unseen visitor from a world that was meant to remain separate from our own. It was a necessary ritual, a way of honoring the underworld. But it was a day everyone was relieved to see end. When the stone was rolled back, the door was sealed, and the dead were once again kept in their place.